Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the massive, invisible forces that shape, well, everything. Our jobs, our wallets, the entire global economy. It's a topic that impacts literally every single one of us, every single day. So let's get right to it.
So here's the million-dollar question. How on earth do you know if a recession is right around the corner? Is it just some giant guessing game, or are there actual, measurable signs out there that we can track? Well, spoiler alert, there are. Today, we're unpacking the exact frameworks and indicators financial analysts use to figure out where the economy is actually headed.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll map out the economic roller coaster, then break down the 4 phases of the cycle. After that, we'll look at the hidden engine, credit. And finally, we'll learn how to read the economic signs.
All right, part 1, the economic roller coaster. Let's demystify what the economy actually is.
You know, we often talk about the economy like it's this unpredictable weather system, but it actually follows the business cycle. Way back in 1946, economists Burns and Mitchell defined this as recurrent expansions and contractions in aggregate economic activity. The absolutely crucial word there is recurrent. It means these cycles happen again and again, but, and this is the catch, you can't exactly set your watch to them. The intensity and the duration, they always vary. One might last just over a year, while another could stretch out for a whole decade.
Looking at this wave moving above and below the straight horizontal line really brings it to life. That straight line, that represents the economy's long-term potential, its trend growth. The wave itself is the actual economic output, the GDP. You can see how actual activity fluctuates like this massive wave around its long-term potential. When it dips below, we've got a negative output gap. Crests above, positive output gap. It is a literal roller coaster of economic activity, and yeah, it can be just as stomach-churning.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 4 phases of the cycle, taking us from recovery all the way to contraction. Understanding these phases is basically like having a map of the roller coaster tracks. Just like the slow climb and the terrifying drop of a ride, the economy moves in a specific sequence. We start down in a trough, then enter recovery. As things heat up, boom, we're in full expansion. Eventually, momentum peaks, we hit a slowdown, and finally, the economy shrinks during a contraction, which drops us right back into the trough to start the whole wild ride over again.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how these phases map exactly to your job prospects and your wallet. In the recovery phase, businesses are, understandably, pretty cautious. So instead of hiring new people, they rely on overtime for their existing workers. Unemployment stays high, and inflation is moderate. But then look at expansion. The economy is booming, new hiring takes off, and unemployment falls. By the time we hit the slowdown, while hiring slows, we might actually see worker shortages, and inflation really starts to accelerate. Finally, in a contraction, it's cut hours, hiring freezes, and layoffs. Inflation does eventually drop, but usually with a really frustrating lag.
Let's actually zoom in on that peak expansion phase for a second. During an expansion boom, the economy truly tests its physical limits. Companies are trying to grow so fast to meet consumer demand that they literally run out of available, qualified workers. And what happens next? They have to start aggressively competing for employees by raising wages. To fund this massive new capacity, they rely heavily on strong cash flows and, crucially, heavy borrowing.
Which leads us nicely to Section 3, the hidden engine, credit. This is the fuel for extreme booms and busts.
So you've got to ask, what's actually funding all that dramatic expansion and the contraction that follows? Where does all that borrowing capacity even come from? Well, enter the credit cycle. This is the invisible engine dictating how easily businesses and households can actually get their hands on borrowed money. While the business cycle looks at real economic output, manufacturing, services, the credit cycle looks at the financial fuel. It tracks the changing availability and the changing price of private sector credit. This is the money that's absolutely essential whether a business wants to build a new factory or a family just hopes to buy a house.
When we put them side by side, a really fascinating dynamic emerges. Business cycles measure real GDP, and generally speaking, they're shorter. Credit cycles, on the other hand, measure the availability of loans and property prices. And here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. Credit cycles tend to be longer, deeper, and way sharper than your standard business cycles. They don't perfectly sync up, they definitely have a rhythm all their own.
Just look at this data from the Bank for International Settlements. The shaded gray areas are recessions, and that red line, that's the financial or credit cycle. This perfectly illustrates how massive financial and credit cycles typically boom, hitting their absolute peaks right before a major recession hits. It's exactly like a rubber band being pulled back as far as it can possibly go. The credit builds and builds until the tension is just too dangerous, and eventually it violently snaps.
Strong peaks in credit cycles are closely associated with subsequent systemic banking crises. Why does this matter to you? Because dangerously loose credit conditions, when basically anyone can easily borrow huge amounts of money, often create massive asset bubbles, particularly in real estate. When those bubbles inevitably burst, they take the broader economy down with them. What could have been a mild business cycle slowdown suddenly turns into a deep, incredibly painful contraction.
All right, Section 4, reading the economic signs. Let's see how we use economic indicators to actually forecast the future.
Okay, so if we know these cycles exist and we know they cause massive disruptions, how do financial pros actually predict the roller coaster's next dramatic turn? Well, they start by looking at leading indicators. Like the name implies, these are data points that change direction before the broader economy does. They're your early warning signal. We're talking about things like the S&P 500, because markets always look ahead, and building permits for new houses, since a permit is pulled long before a crew is hired or lumber is bought. We also track average weekly hours in manufacturing and the yield curve spread, which tells us what the market expects for future interest rates.
What makes these indicators so incredibly powerful is just how logical they are. Take average weekly hours in manufacturing, for instance. Imagine you're managing a factory. If orders start dropping, you don't just instantly fire your permanent staff, right? That's expensive and risky. First, you drastically cut back worker overtime. So overtime drops way before any official layoffs happen. And flip it around. In a recovery, you increase overtime before you commit to hiring a brand new employee. This data gives analysts a direct window into the immediate ground-level decisions that businesses are making every single day.
Now, once those leading indicators start flashing a warning or maybe a green light, we look to coincident indicators for confirmation. These move at the exact same time as the overall economy. They tell us exactly what state we are in right this second. Examples here include the Industrial Production Index, real personal incomes, and manufacturing and trade sales. If leading indicators are hinting at a recovery, but coincident indicators like real personal income are still dropping, well, analysts know the recovery hasn't actually arrived yet.
Finally, we have the lagging indicators. These turn after the economy has already shifted. Think of them as your rearview mirror. They give us final, concrete confirmation that a phase change has definitively happened. A great example is the average duration of unemployment. Why does it lag? Well, as an economy just starts to recover, newly optimistic job seekers flood back into the labor force, but they rarely find work on day one. So statistically, the duration of unemployment can actually stay high or even rise slightly right as the real recovery takes off. Kind of ironic, but statistically true. And to make absolutely sure we're not just looking at a localized fluke in one tiny sector of the economy, analysts use what's called a diffusion index. Basically, if you have a composite index made up of 10 different leading indicators, a diffusion index measures what percentage of them are rising at the exact same time. If it's just one or two, it's probably just noise. But if 80 or 90% of the components are all moving together in the same direction, that proves the economic trend is widespread and incredibly robust. All right, let's wrap up this explainer with the absolute core takeaways. 1. The economy isn't random. It moves through recurrent business cycles with 4 distinct phases: recovery, expansion, slowdown, and contraction, which directly dictate jobs and inflation. 2. Right beneath that business cycle is a deeper, longer credit cycle that fuels the highest booms and, dangerously, the most painful busts. And 3. By smartly tracking a mix of leading, coincident, and lagging indicators, you can map out exactly where the economy is going, where it is right now, and where it's been. I want to leave you with this final thought today. Take everything we just talked about. Look out your window, check the latest news, and ask yourself, based on what you are seeing with hiring, wages, and inflation right now, are we climbing the roller coaster, enjoying the peak, or are we about to drop? Thanks for learning with me today. Stay curious, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.